My guest this week is Reuben Keith Green, a former United States naval officer who was initially an enlisted man in the United States Navy and then got commissioned. He actually left the Navy back in 1997 as a lieutenant commander, having had a really impressive career, but at the same time also faced some enormous challenges as a result of racial discrimination. He's written a book, which we talk about extensively in the podcast, and that book title is Black Officer, White Navy, which kind of tells you all you need to know, I suppose, about where the book comes from and what Keith has been championing really ever since he left the Navy to try and get a better system in place within the Navy that is less discriminatory and just overall better for everyone that's there. It was a fabulous conversation and really interesting, somewhat hard-hitting in places, and I really feel for Keith in what he's done and the way things have gone for him. But I hope you find it interesting. It's certainly quite sobering to think of some of the challenges that are still ongoing in this kind of space, and certainly it's not unique to the United States. Obviously, this is an issue that faces just about every organization, whether they're military or civilian, in one form or another. And so it's a really important set of messages, I think, that Keith brings out. And as I say, I hope you enjoy it. Without further ado, let's go. Keith, fantastic to have you on the podcast. I'm really glad to have you. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you for having me, Bob. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. The more I've read about some of the stuff you've been doing and the kind of background you've got, I think the more I'm convinced it'll be a really fascinating conversation, a very kind of good time as well to do it. Not least with your book just having been more widely published, but we'll get back to that in a while for sure. I mean, just to get us started, you've had a fascinating career inside the Navy, but also since you left the Navy with some of the things you've been doing. I'd be really interested if you could just give us a short summary of everything you've done really up to now.
Well, again, Bob, thank you for having me on your program. I joined the Navy as a high school dropout in 1975. My father was a soldier and a sailor, mostly a sailor. And his father was a soldier during World War II. I'm a third-generation military veteran. I went to Mineman A School, ordnance-type stuff, in Charleston, South Carolina in 1975. I did about 9 years in 3 different fields as an enlisted man, and then I went to officer candidate school after completing my bachelor's degree in my spare time. And after that, I served on 3 consecutive ships and then 1 staff duty. So I had 4 back-to-back sea tours. And then I went to my first shore tour here in Jacksonville, Florida. After that, I had a bad experience in my last tour, retired from the Navy at age 39 and have not had a job since then. 20 years after I retired, I decided to start writing about my experiences and critiquing the Navy, which led to my first self-published book, Black Officer, White Navy, in 2017. And since then, I got a contract with the University Press of Kentucky. They republished the book. It was released in May of 2024. And I've written articles for numerous publications. I've been interviewed by the AP, Military Times, Navy Times, several different organizations. And I'm trying to do what I can to make the Navy better than what it is and all that it can be.
Yeah, it's great. And that's a really helpful start. I mean, I've read a number of those articles that you've been involved in, and the book it actually comes out in the UK in June. It's not available to us over here just yet, but really looking forward to actually being able to read that too. I mean, when you say, you're obviously your father and your grandfather were in the military, and I'd like to talk about kind of early motivations. Is that what motivated you? And, how did you kind of prepare yourself for the start of your Navy career?
Well, actually, what motivated me to join the Navy was reading encyclopedias when I was a kid. I would ask my parents for books all the time, and sometimes they'd buy books they couldn't afford, such as a set of encyclopedias, because I wanted them. And I would look through the encyclopedias, and I would see all these pictures of these admirals in these resplendent uniforms. And I said, I want to be one of those guys. And then towards the latter part of the 70s, I was reading about Admiral Zumwalt and all the problems they were having in the Navy and how he was talking about things were changing and they issued Z-grams on equal opportunity. So Zumwalt was one of my early influences for joining the Navy. My father, because of his experience in the Navy, forbade me from joining the Navy and also refused to sign the papers for me to join. So my mother and stepmother had to sign the papers for me to join. I was 17 and knew everything, so I figured my father didn't know what he was talking about. Did not take long for me to figure out that he knew a lot more than I thought he did.
Yeah, we're all like that when we're 17, I think, aren't we? That's for sure. We know everything and the parents don't know anything. But I mean, with all that, the knowledge you've got now, if you were going back in time and providing advice, I mean, even with what you know now, looking current world, you're providing advice to 16, 17, 18-year-olds now. What advice would you give to them, but also kind of reflectively on your school age, Keith? What would that look like?
Well, I would tell them to study everything that was written that they could find about what it was like for someone like me coming into the military. There were I learned a lot about the Navy that I served in after I was out of the Navy because there are very few stories by Black servicemen from the Vietnam War era, very few first-person accounts. They almost don't exist. But I would try to learn as much as I could about the reality as opposed to the PR versions of what it was like.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I sort of just reflect on some of the things that are out there now. I know Men of Honor as a film, Cuba Gooding Jr. obviously, and Robert De Niro. That's a great movie, which does pretty starkly portray life in the Navy, in a sort of slightly earlier period, clearly for black sailors. I mean, I don't know whether you think what you think about some of that material that's out there and still in kind of current circulation from the last probably 20 years worth of stuff. Do you think it's got better, or do you think there's still an absolute shortage of information?
I think there's still an absolute shortage of information, and I encourage people to write down their stories, to share what it was like, or what it actually is like, because I identified very strongly with that Men of Honor movie. My father was a boatswain mate, just like Carl Brashear, and some of the things that happened in that movie mirror my own experiences almost exactly.
Wow.
Not getting credit for work that I've done and being sabotaged in school, doing very well and then not getting credit for that, being denied a promotion, et cetera, et cetera. So there were lots of things that identify with that. But there's really a dearth in the literature and in the movies. I also identify very strongly with a movie called Crimson Tide, in which Denzel Washington played executive officer on a nuclear submarine, the USS Alabama, and had a major conflict with his commanding officer. That movie, more than anything else I've ever seen, portrayed what it was like or what it could be like for a Black officer serving in the military, especially in times of crisis.
Oh wow, how interesting! Yeah, that's a great film. I really like that movie myself as well. With Gene Hackman, isn't he, is the captain, and yeah, it's terrific. It's a very good film. It's sad, in all sorts of levels to think that your own time was so marred by that, and actually that's still the kind of the case now, with all, as you say, the kind of public face of what is happening in the military is very different to that. And clearly, I mean, if you look at the US military, particularly at the minute, you've got CQ Brown at the top of, former chief of staff of the Air Force and now the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And when I was in the Pentagon for a role as the UK liaison officer to the chairman back in Admiral Mullen's time in 2011, and at that point, Michelle Howard was, I think she was a 1-star then, but she ultimately became a 4-star. First black female officer, I believe, to become a 4-star, certainly in the Navy. And so you're seeing these people do succeed, but there's an undercurrent from what you're saying still of significant challenge that has to be overcome. Then, right?
You are exactly right. And people like to point to people like General Brown and Admiral Howard and say, well, if they achieved it, then why can't all these other people achieve it? But those are primarily those are exceptions. I love General Brown's video that he did after the George Floyd killing. There's a video online, and it's let me tell you what I'm thinking. And I identified with almost every point that he made in that video about how he was treated by his peers and people that questioned his authenticity just because he didn't look like all the white guys standing around him. I've actually met Admiral Howard, and so I identify strongly with those. I met General Brown last year at a promotion ceremony he did, and I explained to him how the Air Force was the only service that provided me the 10 years worth of discrimination complaint statistics I had asked for. And he smiled at me and said, yeah, we're leading the way. So I'm really impressed at how the Air Force has handled things as opposed to some of the other services.
Yeah, well, I'm pleased to hear that as an ex-Air Force guy myself. So I like to think the Air Force, this side of the Atlantic, leads the way a bit as well. But that'll attract me a little bit of banter from some of my colleagues, I'm sure, saying that. Yeah, I guess it's true here too. To be fair, I think when I look at female leaders and ethnic minority leaders, not just in the military but more broadly, there are people who have absolutely succeeded and made it to the very top. In fact, we've just announced the appointment of a female vice chief of defence staff here. So the kind of second most powerful position, I suppose, in the UK military, as a woman in the army, and that I think is the first 4-star we've had. But we have made this side huge strides, been taking it away just from ethnicity to more broadly in terms of diversity generally across probably 30 years or so. When I look back to the start of my career, and it was amazing how challenging a lot of these things were for men and women for a start. Women were paid differently. They were on a completely different pay scale. Even if they're doing exactly the same job, they had to leave. If they got pregnant, they couldn't come back. We definitely had, and arguably still do have, too many pockets of racial discrimination that still exist, although the actual, in theory, there's no limitations around anything in terms of people serving and so on, and indeed there are plenty of some great ethnic diverse characters that I've worked with in my time from all sorts of different races, and that's terrific that we're making progress. But it is as we just talked about, obviously a challenge that we still need a lot more work to do on, and we'll come back to that, I'm sure, in a minute. Just to maybe look at the more positive side of this. I mean, one of the things I do is talk about role models, and I'd be really interested in your reflections on people that have helped you, people that have motivated you. Who are the leaders out there that have really kind of influenced and shaped you over your time, both in and out of the Navy? Who do you think is worthy of recognition in that regard?
Well, one is the guy who saved my career when I was facing a serious headwind from a guy that was my boss. And his name is, he's a retired Master Chief named Daniel Zapiro. He doesn't like me using his name, but he can't stop me. But he saved my career when I was a young enlisted E5 being targeted for destruction because I had fought to get the smoking in classrooms ended because it was against DOD instructions. And I was also suffering because I was a non-smoker. He saved my career. And I do not exaggerate when I say that, because I had a huge target on my back. I've been a very strong admirer of General Colin Powell. I've pretty much read everything that's written by him or about him. And we both have the same INTJ personality type. So he's another strong some person I admired. And someone I've come to admire a great deal is the person that Admiral Zumwalt did more to improve the lives of Black sailors than anybody, and that was his Minority Affairs Assistant, Lieutenant Commander William S. Norman, Bill Norman. He's the one that wrote the Z-gram on equal opportunity. I've read Larry Berman's biography of Zumwalt. And Norman does not get as much credit as he should because he was the driving force behind getting Zumwalt to make all the personnel changes that he did. So he's a true hero of mine. He's still alive. His wife recently passed away, but he's still alive. And I really think the Navy ought to invest some time in honoring this man before he leaves the planet. I've spoken with people at the Naval Historical and Heritage Command about that. Another role model of mine is another unheralded hero, and that's Lieutenant Commander Dennis Denmark Nelson. He wrote The Integration of the Negro into the United States Navy in 1951. The Navy published it as a book. It was his master's thesis, and it was a brilliant piece of writing, particularly the chapter on military justice, which I discuss in my book. So those are three heroes of mine. And I have to add a contemporary one is Dr. John Cordell, a retired Navy surface warfare captain. He and I have teamed up and done some writing. He came to my defense on LinkedIn when I was being attacked by someone who didn't like what I was saying. And so we connected, and I wound up sending him a copy of my first book. And he wrote a great review for Naval Institute Press, and he has been knee deep. We've been shoulder to shoulder in trying to get the Navy to make some changes because of that chance interjection on my part, to defend me against an unprofessional attack. So he's probably my current contemporary hero right now, but I make fun of him all the time.
Yeah, no, it's a good list. I mean, Colin Powell, I have to say, is somebody I always hugely admired as well. I think was was a very, very capable man who clearly not only went to the top of the military, but then in a sort of diplomatic world as well as Secretary of State, and amazing job in that role too, in some really challenging times. Obviously marred by some stuff that went on around particularly around Iraq and weapons of mass destruction and things, but that takes nothing away from his personal capability and just charisma. I think he was a very, very impressive individual. Just on the LinkedIn and attacks on LinkedIn thing, it's an area that's worth us just having a little exploration, because I want to talk about good, bad, and ugly leadership experiences in a minute anyway. But I guess you are now, and to some extent, it sounds like you dedicated a big chunk of your life really post the military in terms of fighting for better justice, better rights, better conditions for particularly the Navy. And you're clearly doing that at a time when the Navy, the establishment as a whole, I suspect, is probably making some pretty strong arguments. Hey, look, we're doing all the right stuff here. We're moving in the right direction. So are you getting a lot of those attacks? And what's the direction of travel? Where are they coming from?
Well, initially I was attacked. I was called a racist. I was called a radical, et cetera, et cetera. And after I wiped the floor with so many of my attackers, because I just used logic, you bring nothing to the table but opinion and confidence. And when I present facts to people, they ignore my questions and will not counter with their own facts, just their opinions. So my attackers have pretty much died down. But what I get now is basically a wall of silence. They talk to each other, but they don't talk to me. So I think the Navy's strategy is just kind of wait this guy out, ignore him, and hope nobody pays attention to him. But what I'm trying to do is make the Navy better than it is. And when you get to the epilogue of my book, you will see the impact that Dr. Cordell and I have had in moving the needle. There have been significant changes made because of the writings that we have done separately and together. So, but yeah, for the most part, I don't get nearly the kind of pushback that I did have. And I always try to respond to those attacks with courteous responses, asking them to back up what they're saying. I can back up what I'm saying. If I was wrong about something, it would have been blasted all over LinkedIn and everywhere else by now. But pretty much everything I have said is a problem, has turned out to be a problem, as admitted by the Navy, by DOD, et cetera. So I feel like I'm on solid ground in terms of the knowledge base I bring to the problem and the way I present it.
Yeah, perhaps I maybe didn't phrase it quite right when I was asking the question in the first place. I mean, most of the detractors, as it were, coming from just individuals who just don't agree with you, or from the kind of Navy establishment side as well? Because it does sound as though, from some of the stuff I've read about what you've been doing and the progress you've been making, that the Navy itself is listening and taking some stuff on board and so on. Maybe not as quickly as you'd like, and that's always the case with some of these changes. But is that the general direction of travel for the Navy positive, and it's more individuals who just basically just don't subscribe and think you're kind of making an argument that doesn't need to be made or whatever, and so it's more individual than it is system? Or if I'm being clear.
Well, it's a little of both. I've had serving squadron commanders come and say that things are better than they were, and they didn't see the problems that I'm pointing out. Let's say regarding beards and PFB. And I've asked one squadron commander, have you talked to a young Black sailor about what it's like walking around with a no-shave chip and the way that person is treated? And when people tell me, well, it's better than it was, I say, well, how do you measure that? How do you quantify that? And if it's better than it was, then why does the Task Force Navy have all these recommendations for improving things? Some of the same problems that were present in 1988 are still present in today's Navy. So how do you quantify, how do you measure that progress? But mostly what I get is, things aren't as bad, or my favorite is, in 30 years in the Navy, I never saw any racism. And that just blows me away. And it's always from some white guy who has never had to walk around as a minority. And of course, he hadn't seen it because it's not directed at him. Or if he did see it, he just considered it business as usual. So as far as the Navy itself, big Navy, they have pretty much ignored me to the full extent that they can. For instance, the article that I wrote about renaming the USS John C. Stennis, it was published in Proceedings in 2020. That went all the way around the world. It was even commented on by some Russian bloggers, translated into French. And it was Korea. You name it. It was all over the place. But the Navy had no comment about it at the time, and to this day has made no official comment about it. So I think it's a travesty that you have a ship named for a dedicated white supremacist, and you have diverse sailors from all over the world serving in that ship, named for a man who fought tooth and nail to make sure they didn't have the opportunities that they do have, and saying that he was for whites having the opportunity to serve on all white ships. Navy has yet to address that issue, and that's a personal one for me.
So now it's really interesting. I read that article that you obviously wrote about Stennis and the sort of renaming of the ship and so on, and it just kind of sits with. I feel that there's a debate still running on the Army side, not least around renaming of some military establishments and changes to rules around Confederate flags and those sorts of things. So there seems to be a debate that is gaining some traction there, even if it's slow. Does that feel right, or is this something that is still just kind of stuck with no real progress?
Well, the Base Renaming Commission, all of the recommendations that they had for renaming the bases, all of those bases have been renamed, and nobody died. Nobody, there was no problem. People have accepted it. They've moved on, and that chapter of history is closed, and another chapter is being rewritten. And nobody's awards got changed. Nobody's plaques, jackets. They still have everything they still had, except moving forward, they don't have to serve in a base that was named for someone that fought against the United States of America. So that's moved on. I believe the same thing is possible with the Stennis. They did rename two ships associated with the Confederacy, USNS Maury and the USS Chancellorsville, which was named for a battle that the Union lost. So the closest thing to a Confederate since then is the USS John C. Stennis. He called his Jefferson Davis's desk in his Senate office, and he called it the flagship of the Confederacy. That's where the Southern Manifesto was written. So he's the one that ordered the 1973 hearings on permissiveness in the Navy after the Kitty Hawk disturbances. And there's a great book called Against All Tides by Marvin Truey, and he just blows a hole in that whole scenario that was presented about what happened on the Kitty Hawk, because he was a defense counsel for 5 or 6 of those sailors that were accused. He waited 50 years, but he did not want to die without the truth having been told. And that's a great book. I really love that book. And at the same time that was happening, my father was leaving the Navy because of race in 1973.
Yeah, wow. I mean, that's quite a good segue, really, into the kind of direct experiences that I said I was going to come back to, where when I talk with lots of other guests on the podcast about their own leadership experiences and the traits they like and the things that have impressed them and or depressed them to some extent. I mean, it'd be really interesting just to get, Keith, a few of your kind of direct experiences, good and bad. I mean, things that you've seen over the, particularly during your own service. I mean, what put some color, if you like, into the debate about why some of these things are a real problem, because I don't think necessarily it gets as much airtime as would be useful, and people hear noise about but there's racist behavior and so on. But I mean, what does that actually feel like from your point of view? What have you experienced?
Oh my goodness. Well, beginning in early in my career, right after boot camp, I ran into a buzzsaw of racism at Charleston, South Carolina, when I was the youngest person in my Miami A school class. We had 26 or 27 people. I was the youngest person, and I was also the only high school dropout, and I was also the only Black student in the class. So to make a long story short, I got cheated out of accelerated advancement. I qualified for accelerated advancement, and they lied to me. I graduated number 2 in my class, and they lied to me and said that I could not be promoted because I was a reservist. So I had to go back to my reserve unit. And then I turned right around and came back on active duty. I declined the promotion because I didn't want to piss them off. But the other thing that happened was I qualified for honor roll, but my GPA was a 3.62, and they lowered it just a smidgen to 3.57, sending me a message. So they cheated me out of 2 things. But when I got back to Charleston, I wound up going to work in the admin office, and I did 2 deployments, one in Sicily and one in Scotland. For the most part, the Sicily department was fine. Deployment was fine, except I had a run-in with a bartender who wouldn't serve me in the on-base club. I wrote a letter to the base exchange officer explaining what had happened, and he called me to his office, and he said, "You will not have any more problems in my club. I'm sorry that happened to you. And if you have any further problems, don't write me a letter. I want you to come to my office and tell me what happened." And the next time I walk in that club, you would have thought Admiral Zumwalt walked in there. They just swarmed me. I thought it was a joke at first, but I could see the fear in their eyes from a little skinny 19-year-old seaman just from writing a letter explaining what had happened. And then I did a deployment to Scotland. I spent 6 months in Scotland, faced some racism there, got into a couple fights, had a great trip to London for the Queen's Silver Jubilee. I've got pictures of the Queen in her carriage for the Silver Jubilee. And but I left Scotland. I was just done with the mine force because it was just too much. But I could go on and on and on about the racism I faced. When I was a chief engineer on a frigate in the Persian Gulf, I calculated that I had a race-based negative interaction about once every 3 weeks. And some of them were pretty severe. One that I did not include in the first book, but included in this one, my life was put in danger by men on a working party because they didn't like being bossed around by a Black officer. And I happened to be the senior officer on the ship at the time doing an evolution. And some of these men walked away, and I could have been killed and lost a $100,000 piece of equipment. So that's one that stuck with me. But yeah, I could go on and on. The very worst was my last year in the Navy, where I went to work for a guy from Alabama who took one look at me and decided I couldn't do the job I'd been ordered in to do and gave me the lowest job he could find. And then once he finally reviewed my record and I schooled him on who I was, gave me not only the job I'd been ordered in there to take, but he also gave me another full-time department head job. So I was getting 2 jobs for the price of one. And but I was being denied the resources to do one of the jobs. For instance, I was the base telephone officer, but I couldn't get a cell phone for myself because the comptroller, former enlisted Marine, would intercept it, give it to somebody else, and tell me he'd order another one. So resource denial was the constant feature of the battles that I faced once I became a commissioned officer.
I mean, you've mentioned a couple of times, that particular individual was from Alabama. South Carolina's clearly, cropped up there, Charleston, etc. I mean, is there a real divide within the US that is still a challenge with this? Is it different if you're in different parts of the US, or is that something that is, and from the individual point of view, is it just ingrained in them that they've brought up that way generationally, and that's why they feel that way? What's your thought?
I can't speak to what it's like now. I've been out of the Navy since 1997, but historically, the Navy has been very attractive in the officer corps from members from the South. And when I mentioned the gentleman from Alabama, he was a college student in 1971 when Martin Luther King was assassinated, going to the University of Auburn, where there were no Black students at all, with the exception of one Black student in the graduate program. So he was raised in an environment where Blacks were just considered inferior, and they fought tooth and nail to keep it that way. So, but it's not necessarily geographic specific, but I have found that Southerners tend to have prominence in the Navy, and particularly in the officers' corps. I don't know. I don't have any statistics to back that up, but I found that historically to be the case. When I served most of my career in two places that were once considered unsuitable for the assignment of Blacks in the Navy, and one of those was Charleston, South Carolina, the other was Jacksonville, Florida. So there were and still are some lingering challenges that Black servicemen face when assigned in the South. As a matter of fact, I just read recently that service members are declining assignments in certain areas of the South because of the prevailing hostility of Blacks in those areas, and the military is honoring those requests. So I would say that according to the military, yes, they still think that's a problem.
Wow, in 2024, that's amazing, isn't it? And depressing, that's for sure. What about positive experiences? I mean, you must have, you've mentioned a couple already in terms of some of the role models, but where are what are the behaviors that have impressed you, I guess, in this space?
I got off to a great start in my officer career. I worked for two really good captains, and Captain Jim Barton was my second CO on my first ship, and he really looked out for me. He gave me lots of opportunities. He recommended me for department head school early. He read early drafts of my first book, and he learned a lot from reading that. And matter of fact, he left a review of my book on Amazon saying some of what he learned about what had happened to me was shocking. So those were two positive influences. I had some great leaders, great department heads. One of the most positive was a Navy captain named Robert H. Rankin. He assigned me, this was when I went to my first staff duty job. I was going from 3 back-to-back arduous sea tours, and I got a safety officer billet on a destroyer squadron staff. It was a brand new billet. Nobody knew what I was doing, which meant that I didn't have to do anything if I didn't want to, for the most part. But after watching me for 3 months, he called me into his office and said, "I want you to take over the import training department." And I said, "Thank you, Captain, but I'm happy where I am." And I started a master's program, and I'd really just rather stay where I am. So he says, "You know how this works. If you don't volunteer for it, you're probably going to get it anyway." So I asked him if I could sleep on it, and he said yes. I came in the next morning, and of course, I volunteered. It turns out he'd given me the best job I'd ever had in the Navy. I was able to take that highly contentious job and turn it into the flagship for that staff. And at the end of that tour, Admiral J. Paul Reason, who was about to become a 4-star, came down to retire my Commodore. And the Commodore said, "Feed me all the stuff you guys have been doing in training." So I brought in a big spoon to the morning meeting, and I fed him all this stuff. And at the end of that, Admiral Reason looked at me and said, "I wish everyone was doing training the way you guys do it here. And that was the proudest moment in my military career. And all of these people that I've spoken about are white guys. I never worked for a black officer the whole time I served in the Navy. So all of my mentors and all my positive role models, for the most part, were white guys that took me under their wing and tried to help me get to where I needed to be. And they did that because I was an effective officer and I was good at my job. But on the other side of that was those that did what they could to prevent me from having success. And some of them went to extreme measures to do so.
Yeah, it's really striking, isn't it? And what's your thought? You may, I mean, you'll have an opinion on this. I'm sure you may not have any kind of evidence for it, but the positive white role models you talk about, what did they think about the kind of treatment of you and other black officers and enlisted guys by other white people? Did they actively try and do something to improve that and to stop people from overtly being racist, or did they just basically not see the problem, as it were?
Well, I'll give you a perfect example. They tried to ignore the problem. And this is the example I use a lot. I had a skipper who was from Texas. Good guy, liked him a lot, very funny, but he had a blind spot when it came to race. They did not want to deal with issues of race. I was preparing to deploy on a 6-month deployment, and my supply officer was not ordering the critical parts that I needed to make repairs and get the ship ready to go. I had casualty reports that I had to file, but I couldn't file them until the supply officer had processed all my paperwork. So I complained to the supply officer, I complained to the XO, the captain, and they all said, work it out with the supply officer. I talked to the other department heads and said, hey, I need help here. You guys having problems. Nobody was having problems. They just assumed I was incompetent. I got a perfect score in material management in officer candidate school, and I had 10 years in the Navy. I knew how the supply system worked. What I didn't know was why I was having all these problems. So I sat up one night and created a spreadsheet of my 25 most critical parts, and I broke out all this data from different sections in the computer reporting system and put it all on a spreadsheet. And when the captain walked in that morning, I handed it to him. I said, Captain, I've been telling you I'm having a problem with getting these parts. If I don't get these parts pretty soon, this ship isn't going to be able to deploy on time. And you're going to have to explain that to somebody. And you're not going to be able to blame me because I've been asking for help and haven't been able to get it. He calls the supply officer in. We go over the report. And at the end of that meeting, he's yelling at the supply officer, telling him, I want all these parts ordered right now, today, which meant that I had this deluge of work that I had to complete all at once. And the captain liked that report so much that he ordered me to teach the rest of the department heads how to do it. And he wanted a report from all of us every day. So now we each have an additional piece of work to do. And they're all mad at me because they've got to do all this extra work. But none of them are willing to speak up and say, Captain, you need to look at this. He's having a problem. So rather than deal with the issue, which was discrimination against the only black officer on the ship, he decided to make everyone do what I had to do. It made him a lot smarter about what was going on his ship, but they just ignored the real issue. And that happened throughout my tour on that ship. So, for the most part, they want to ignore. And there was another big blow up I had where I was facing a potential court martial for cursing out a senior officer in the middle of his morning meeting in front of all his people because I was being jerked around by another warrant officer under similar circumstances.
Yeah, difficult. I really feel for you. It must have been very, very difficult to kind of stay motivated and keep your enthusiasm. And I mean, I guess that takes me into that sort of space as well, really, because I'm interested in how do you personally, from your own managing yourself, but also managing, because there must have been a whole, with the black enlisted guys who were working in and around you as well at that stage, and motivating them, keeping the kind of positive view of what you were doing, at a tactical level on the ship you were on potentially at any one time, but also of the Navy more broadly. How did you handle that when you were having to deal with the kind of personal stuff you were dealing with?
Well, it was very difficult because I didn't have a sounding board. 3 ships in a row, I didn't have a a contemporary, junior or senior, that I could go to and discuss some of the things that I was dealing with and facing. So it was a very isolating experience. Of course, there's a separation between the officers and enlisted as far as I made the mistake of kind of hanging out with some black sailors one time on Liberty, and that was a mistake which I never made again because it blurred the lines between officer and enlisted. So I was essentially spent a lot of time by myself. But the way I handled it was just buckle down and just power through it. But it was an isolating experience, and I didn't realize how much it had taken out of me until 20 years after I retired.
What manifested itself then? Why did you realize at that point?
Well, I had a young man, this is the only black officer I served with on my first ship, and he read my book. Writing the book was very difficult. I had several periods where I got very despondent because I said, this is going to piss a lot of people off. There's a lot of stuff in here that's embarrassing about me personally and also embarrassing to the Navy. So I was very despondent right after I sent the book, having some pretty negative thoughts. But after this gentleman read the book, he called me up, said, Keith, he said, you need to file a claim. He says, what you went through, you're entitled to compensation from the VA. And I'd never thought about that. So I went back and found paperwork where I'd been diagnosed with dysthymia, which is chronic depression, in my last job. I mean, it was probably the most difficult professional experience I'd ever had psychologically. And so I submitted my paperwork about a year after I called the VA crisis line, and they granted me 70% disability right away. They denied my claim for post-traumatic race-based discrimination. And then the VA is currently being sued for discriminating against Black veterans. So even after I retired, it's still a battle to get compensation for what I believe I went through. So, but yeah, it was, when I do these interviews, oftentimes I have to go lay down and take a nap because I feel like I'm back in the fight again. And, the cortisol kicks in, you're reliving these experiences, and it just wears you out. But I've gotten a little better at that. I've gotten a little better at that, but it's still, you can't talk about it without putting yourself back in that situation, the flashbacks and the discussions and what have you. So, but yeah, it took someone telling me, and my own personal behavior, manifestations of trauma are evident all around me. So I have to be careful with that because anger is not very far from the surface when I'm placed in a situation where I'm under attack somehow or being mistreated. So I have to be very, very careful with that.
Yeah, I can imagine that completely. And when you, in your dialogue with sort of more senior players in the military and so on, but I mean, we talked earlier about Michelle Howard and CQ Brown, for example. I mean, they have clearly got to very senior position. They've been successful, as we talked about. They've been exceptions perhaps rather than the norm, but they must have experienced racism along the way and some real challenging times along the way, and because I just can't believe they would have not had that happen to them. What do they say about that? What do they do to try and address that and use that example to try and improve things themselves in terms of the way that again, not just the Navy but the military generally is running?
Publicly, they don't say much at all. And I think that's a problem because the people that do speak up, they're identified as troublemakers or what have you. But it's a very common experience. I've had Black officers tell me, we all face discrimination. We all face racism. I had a guy who retired as a 2-star rear admiral tell me, he invited me to lunch after he read my book. And it was supposed to be lunch, and we sat and traded sea stories for 5 hours. And he said he wanted me to help him write his memoirs. But at the end of the lunch, put his hand on my shoulder as we were getting ready to leave. And he said, the only difference between your story and mine is the depth of the scar. And that stuck with me because this guy was a nuclear trained engineer, had a stellar career, and he went through some of the same things I did. Some of the stories he told me, I told him one story, and he looked at me and said, you're lucky they didn't kill you. So I guess my scars run a little deeper than his, but I've talked to other senior flag officers, and they experienced some of the same things that I did. But the fact that they don't talk about it does a disservice to the Navy, because the Navy doesn't really understand that this is not isolated. This is common.
Yeah, and that's kind of my point. It's interesting, isn't it? That is sad that that's the case. Hey, bring it back to you personally. Then highs and lows. I always try and do this with my interview guests. Talk about everyone's had a roller coaster ride. You probably have had a more of a roller coaster ride than many because of some of the stuff you've experienced. But when you look back across not only your Navy career, but what you've done subsequent to the Navy, is there anything you wish you'd done differently? And if so, why?
Well, I'll tell you, the one thing I wish I'd done differently was when I was being discriminated against by my last CO. I filed a 5-page discrimination complaint against him. It was rock solid, and he had 48 hours to respond to my request to send it to the General Court Martial Authority, which was an admiral that had ordered a Navy performance audit on me because I challenged him on his assumptions. He was trying to get me to do something that wasn't in the best interest of the Navy. So he called the Secretary of the Navy and ordered a performance audit on me. They agreed with me, so he had to back down. But what I wish I had done differently is push that complaint through all the way, because this guy was unfit to lead people. He was protected, and an Admiral Border committed suicide 5 days after I filed my complaint. And so that took the fight out of me. The Navy didn't need any more bad press. I had enough time in the service to retire. And I knew that if I pushed that, they were probably going to find a way to destroy me. But that bothered me for a long time. It has taken numerous people, both inside and outside the military, the mental health profession and whatnot, to tell me that you did the right thing. If you had pushed that, they would have destroyed you. And I believe that's true. But it bothers me from the standpoint of, I knew that I was right. I knew that what I was doing was the right thing to do, but I was going up against a system that was not going to validate what I said, no matter how true it was, because it would have been a black eye on them.
Yeah, I can see that. And you got to know when to bend with the breeze and when to break in all situations, haven't you? And there is no point, by and large, in pushing it to the point where you break, because it usually is yourself rather than anything else in those sort of circumstances. So I totally get that. It's just such a sad indictment of the system, really, isn't it? More positively, though, what's your most significant achievement? What's the do you consider the thing you're most proud of, I guess, in all that you've done?
Well, in all that I've done, one of the things I'm most proud of is pushing the Department of Defense and the Navy to acknowledge that the things that I've been saying for years are true. I said that there was discrimination in the military justice system. DOD did a deep dive, went back and looked back decades, and came to the exact same conclusion. And Assistant Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks said that this is unacceptable. And she issued a memo with 18 specific taskings for various entities, organizations, provided funding and deadlines for that. So that validated what I'd been saying for years. I also said that the military's formal discrimination complaint system was failing both commands and the people that used it. They did a study and found out that 91% of all the complaints submitted are incomplete, incorrect. And they have ordered a database to be developed to track those discrimination complaints, and because they don't exist. I filed for 10 years worth of complaint data several years ago. The Navy and the Coast Guard ignored my request. And if you know anything about what's been going on when the Coast Guard with Operation Fouled Anchor, you could see that they'd been hiding decades worth of complaints and discrimination and harassment and racism. And they tried to convince me that everything was well, but they wouldn't respond to my request. Well, now I know why. The Navy completely ignored my request, but John Cordell and I wrote an article about the DOD's unfinished business, 10-point plan And one of those was the discrimination complaint database. And that happened in October of 2022. And by, I think it was February of 2023, the Navy put out a report saying they were developing a database so that they could track discrimination complaints and evaluate trend data. So they took the report, that the article that we wrote, and took action on it. They had been trying to do it for a while, but they were having turnover and funding issues. But now they have made it a priority. So those are some things that I can point to that have led to positive change, and I'm proud of that. I don't get any credit for it, obviously.
I was just about to ask you that, whether you'd actually got any credit, or because I can completely understand why you're really proud of that, and but being proud of it and being credited for it is two different things, aren't they? Sadly.
I'll give you one more example. I was writing about Charles Jackson French. He was a steward in World War II whose ship got torpedoed, and he was in a life raft, 6 or 7 white sailors, some of them injured, and they were drifting in toward shore where the Japanese were. So he looked down at the sharks in the water, and he looked at the shore, and he decided he'd rather take his chances with the sharks. So he swam out to sea, away from the shore, and they were rescued by a Navy ship. They called him the human tugboat. I read about him in a book called Black Men in Blue Water by Chester A. Wright, who was a former steward himself. And I started talking about that, and it got picked up on LinkedIn and elsewhere. And then former Chinfo for the Navy said, we're going to do something to honor French. So they named a swimming pool after him. And then they gave a medal to his family that he should have received when he was doing what he was doing. And then they've since named a warship after him. So once again, I get no credit for any of that, but all of this started happening after I talked about the guy and wrote about it.
Yeah, fascinating. I'm almost hesitant to ask the next question. Your career low point?
My career low point was leaving the Navy. I had 1 year left on shore duty, at least a year, but gone through all the hard stuff. But I knew that having filed that complaint, I was going to have a bullseye on my back. So I decided to leave the Navy. I left with a bad taste in my mouth, did not have a retirement ceremony. So I've talked about that. The other career low point was the completion of that engineering tour, where I had an assist visit, so-called assist visit, engineering assist visit. You're supposed to have one every 6 months. I went 18 months between visits because of the hectic schedule and fires, explosions, casualties we had. And the assist visit did not go as well as it could have, because we had 2 C4 casualties where we were basically stuck to the pier repairing some major maintenance-related issues. So they just spent the whole week going through our administrative programs. And the captain held that against me, despite the fact that I had a stellar, 22-month serving him. And I got dinged on my fitness report going out the door, whereas men that had crashed $15 million helicopter first day into the Med on the way to the Persian Gulf, they leave the ship with Navy Achievement Medals. The fly officer that was harming my ability to get my parts, I'm sure he got a medal at the end of this tour. And all of these people that are rewarded on their way out the door that had real issues. And I just had an assist visit that did not go well. And it was some Mickey Mouse stuff in there. It's all in the book. So that was a low point for me. The captain that I really admired and thought was my friend dinged me on the way out the door. I didn't get an end-of-tour medal for that tour. And it was psychologically, I was just fried when I left that job. But I went on to be the executive XO of a Navy hydrofoil. I was a junior XO in the squadron, the only black officer in the squadron. And when I left that squadron, the Commodore told me that I was the best XO in his squadron. So I was able to recover from that. But those were 2 low points: the end of my engineering tour and the end of my first and final short tour in the Navy.
Yeah, I can imagine both of those as well. One of the things that really strikes me listening to you is your ability So your personal resilience, if you like, your ability to bounce back from what's clearly been some pretty tough times. And I mean, that takes me into a kind of broader conversation about healthy living and work-life balance and de-stressing and all those sorts of things. But before we even get to that, just how easy or difficult have you found it to rebound from some of those things? So you finish one tour where it's really, really frustrating and dissatisfying, and people that you thought were kind of had your back didn't in the end, and how have you lifted yourself out of that to get to a point where you then go to a new job and turn the page and start with a kind of relatively fresh look at it? Has that been an easy thing to do, or has that been really tough?
Well, when I went to report to a new job, I'd go stand in the mirror naked and I'd look at my backside and I'd look at all the scars on my butt that I'd earned in the previous job. And I'd remember what scar represented what. And then I'd make sure that I didn't make that mistake again. So I tried to not repeat some of the same mistakes or set myself up for some of the same situations. I would, if I sensed a problem, I would immediately address that with the person that was causing me the problem. Let them know that I was on to whatever it was they were doing, and then oftentimes that was able to forestall any of the problems I'd had previously. But I just knew that I could do my job, and I did it well. I wasn't bashful about calling out issues that I thought needed to be fixed, and I always found that generally people respect good performance and will reward that, especially if it's helping them. I did everything I could to make sure my bosses were successful. And by and large, for the most part, that was appreciated and respected. So you go to work for crazy people, and then it doesn't really matter. If they don't like you, they just don't like you. But I just refused to quit. Quitting was not in my vocabulary.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you're still in that place as well, which is good for you. You mentioned obviously you majority of the time you'd work for just for white officers. Did you work for any black officers at any point?
Not only did I not work for any black officers, I very seldom saw any because there were so few of us. When I
Wow.
was commissioned, only 3.5% of the officers in the Navy were black, and most of those were not in the surface. They were all in the fly corps and logistics and stuff like that. So they were there, but there just weren't many. I used to know the names of every black officer in the Mayport Basin. There were only like 5 or 6 of us. And there were many ships. These guys don't understand now that I didn't have anyone that I felt comfortable going to discuss some of the problems that I had, because there was a certain aloofness, especially if you had people that were a little more senior. They didn't want to be seen as, showing favoritism, and that's an issue that existed way back in 1980. I found a master's thesis from the Naval Postgraduate School, a guy named Jerry Ford, and he talked about those very issues. And it's also an issue. I had a guy contact me, said that my son is dealing with that exact same issue right now. So being a black officer in the military can be something of an isolating experience. It's better now than it was, but way back in the 70s and 80s, it was extremely difficult.
Yeah. I can certainly imagine that just from some of the things I've read about more broadly than just talking to you, but also from what you've been saying now. There's tough times, especially when there are so few of you. I've talked in one of my other podcasts actually about loneliness of command, which I think is a real issue for people in leadership positions where you don't have people to talk to. But I've never really thought about it from the point of view of just being one of a very limited number of a particular type of person. So in your case, obviously being, one of, if not the only black officer most of the time, that does leave you in a pretty lonely and isolated position automatically. And that generates a whole set of challenges. I can see that.
One of the things the Navy did when they started putting women on ships and women on submarines, they would send them in with a group of 5 or 6, so they had a support system. And that was very helpful, particularly women going on board ships. And submarines. They didn't do that with black officers. Typically, a black officer was isolated, and black officers that come from HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, these were kids that were raised in a majority black environment, went to a majority black school, and then they're cast into a wardroom where they're the only black officer, They don't have a lot in common culturally with the people that they're serving with. I had a guy tell me when I was a JG going to department head school, he had done that. He didn't do well in his service career. He told me, he looked me in my face and said, "Keith, those white boys ate me alive." And he was being forced out of the Navy. Went on to go on to a stellar career in the reserves, retired as a rear admiral, won all sorts of medals and stuff. But the surface Navy just ate him alive. And during that time period, blacks were being driven out of the surface Navy regularly. It almost happened to me, but it was a very difficult time in the surface Navy back in the mid to late 80s. And it's improved some, but I don't have firsthand experience on that.
Yeah, for sure. No, actually, I was going to ask you a little bit about what your perception is of improvement, but also looking at your book. I mean, you know, one of the things that led me to you in the first place was looking at the title of a book where you've written a book called Black Officer, White Navy. I mean, you don't need to say much before you know what the book's about, clearly. And that is it's a powerful title. And clearly the fact it's been, you know, initially you self-published it, I think, didn't you, back in 2017? And then, you know, obviously it's now been picked up and it's going slightly more mainstream and or a lot more mainstream. And it's clearly going to be available in a lot more places and hopefully it's going to get a lot more take-up. I mean, what are your kind of hopes for that and where where do you see that going and how much more traction is it giving you in terms of some of the debate for some of the stuff you're trying to do to improve life for people, for black officers or black enlisted guys as well in the Navy?
Well, primarily, I wrote the book so that leaders, no matter what their color or their gender, could understand. They could follow an ambitious, intelligent, motivated young sailor from, a technical field in the Navy to a career on warfighting platforms and understand the challenges that individual might face. So they can't say, well, I didn't know these things happened, because now they can follow someone that through the process of an entire career. I don't know that it gives me any more credibility. I would like some company, other people sharing their stories. I know that there are other books in progress from Black service members, but for now, I pretty much got the field all to myself. And I'm not getting a lot of, and I understand it from the active duty people. Anybody that speaks up to support me puts a target on their back. But the retired, the old bulls, the retired flag officers, et cetera, telling me privately that they're proud of me and they appreciate what I'm doing does not add anything to the conversation for the people that think I'm a one-off or I'm a radical or, whatever. I'm not speaking. I'm speaking for the people that can't speak for themselves. And it gets kind of lonely when you look over your shoulder to see where the rest of the cavalry is and there's nobody back there.
Yeah, I can imagine that. And I totally get that point about if someone's saying something to you privately. I mean, it's great. And it's nice on one level, but it doesn't add any value to the debate if they're not prepared to stand up and actually be kind of properly counted. So it's really important to try and get people who are prepared to to front up to that for sure. We talked about a lot of stressful stuff here. I'm going to come back to a kind of broader US perspective in a minute, but I mentioned healthy living and work-life balance. I mean, what have you found as outlets for you in a world where you have felt a lot of pressure for a long period of time? Clearly had some pretty difficult experiences. What did you do and what do you do now to kind of de-stress, relax, recover?
One of the smartest things I did was I bought an old house. Was built in 1904. It looked like I felt. It was condemned. There were portions falling down. It had been occupied for years. Vines were growing through the second story sunroom roof. It looked like I felt. And I bought that property on a 3-year balloon mortgage because there was no way I could get a loan on it in the condition it was in. So I worked, tirelessly on that house, doing all sorts of work, construction, all sorts of stuff. And that was my outlet. I would work myself to exhaustion. And I'd roll over in the middle of the night, roll over onto a circular saw. I was in the bed. So, but, and I did a lot of construction. I built a concrete fountain. I've been in walkways, a parking arbor. I built walls out of old 100-year-old block brick that I salvaged. So I spent a lot of time outside creating gardens and gardening spaces. And so that was good for me, being outside and doing that sort of thing. Every time I would try to type a resume or put in for a job online, I would physically get sick to the stomach and my hands would start to sweat. I'd break out into sweat. So I knew that it was probably not a good idea for me to go to work for somebody. I was worried about the reaction I would have as a civilian if I was being mistreated out in the workforce. So I spent my prime income earning years without any wage income. And it wasn't until I started drawing Social Security and getting the disability benefits that I got some, fiscal breathing room. So, but for me, it was mostly creative outlets, building stuff with my hands and planting stuff and watching it grow and stuff like that.
Yeah, which must have been great. I can completely see the kind of that takes you into a different place. Very satisfying when you feel you've created something and improved it as well. I mean, I'm loving the analogy of the house felt like you felt like the house looked. That's that's a really good one. On a broader US point, I've had a number of US guests recently, and I think I look from this side of the Atlantic in the UK at what's going on in America. I've spent a lot of time in America. I first went there when I was a 14-year-old boy, and we traveled extensively, and I've been there many times since, both work and pleasure, and spent 9 months living there in 2011, as I mentioned, in a job in the Pentagon. I have never seen your country more divided, and the sort of political narrative in particular, seems to be incredibly challenging, incredibly fractured. I guess you're looking, you're seeing the same situation. You're looking at it through a particular set of lenses that, not least the ones that have influenced a lot of your life so far. I just wonder what your perspectives are and how you see that playing out this year and beyond as we get into next presidential election cycle with the candidates that you've got, et cetera. What does the future look like from your point of view?
Well, I'm very worried about the future because I've studied this history all the way back from the Fugitive Slave Act to the Wilmington Insurrection in 1898 to the Vietnam War conflicts, against Fighting on Two Fronts was a great book by George Westheider where he talked about the military dividing itself, eating itself alive. And so I've studied a lot of this stuff, and I'm very worried. These things tend to go in cycles, and I agree with you. This is the worst it's been since right before the Civil War, as far as I'm concerned. And there were some bad things happening, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. But this is the first time I've really been concerned that we may again be approaching violence against political parties on a larger scale. It's very concerning. I gave a talk in 2019, in January of 2019. I have a small YouTube channel, and the title of the talk was From the Red Summer of 1919 to the Anxious Summer of 2019. And most of what I predicted in that talk has come to pass. The backlash, the violence, et cetera, et cetera. I had no idea that shortly after I gave that talk, there was going to be an assault on the Capitol, Confederate flags being waved around in the Capitol. So it was worse than I thought it was going to be, and it's gotten worse since then. So I'm really concerned.
Yeah, I hope. I mean, I share your concern completely. I think I kind of look and go, wow, this could end badly. You can see it, the obvious risks there around what might or might not happen as, particularly in the election cycle and, a re-energization of kind of civil unrest that comes from that, which, could be very unattractive. I mean, and I just hope that's not the case, because I think you live in a fantastic country with so much to enjoy about it, and it's such a pity to see it being so challenged. That's for sure. Let's just hope for more positive things for the future. We're getting towards the end here, Keith. I mean, I'm conscious you've been very open and shared a lot of great stuff, and so I'm very grateful to you for that. What's the most memorable event of your career to date?
The most memorable event of my career. Um, I guess it was that sitting in that room. I'm basically the only Black person in that room when Admiral Reason, J. Paul Reason, became the first Black four-star admiral in the Navy. Um, tells that entire room full of people that he's proud of me and the job that I've done there. And I was the junior department head on the whole staff. So I was the smallest department and it was the busiest department. And I stood head and shoulders above those guys. And it was really good to have someone like that recognize that in a public forum. So that was memorable. The other memorable event in my career was, and this is a small thing, but it was important to me. I was under attack in the job I was doing as an E5. I was an equal opportunity program specialist. I was in a hostile environment, in a maintenance organization, the good old boy network. And I was eligible to take the E6 exam. No one expected me to make it because I was taking it early. But I had studied those questions so well. I typed all the questions and answers out, the rate training manuals, and then I put them on tape. And I studied them day and night. And when I took that exam, I was selected early I made E6 in 6.5 years. This is after having declined an early promotion several years before. So it was really, I was really prideful of the fact that no one expected me to become an E6 at that early stage. And when I put on my crow as a first class petty officer, I instantly became one of the most senior Black people in the entire United States Navy. So that was significant for me.
Yeah, I bet. No, fantastic. And we didn't actually talk about that. I mean, because you went through as an enlisted guy and then obviously got commissioned into to being an officer. How was that transition? Did you find that, was it more difficult because you're Black, or was it just okay and pretty seamless, or how was it?
The transition was great because I had two great bosses, and I would make light of stuff that happened but I would also use it as an opportunity to show, I can run circles around you guys. One day we were at officers call, and we had this fearsome XO, and he walked up to officers call, agitated one day, and looked at me and said, "Do you have a paper clip?" So I reached in my pocket and handed him one. I happened to be the communications officer. So there were 10 other ensigns and all the other officers there. So they start razzing me about why did he ask you if you had a paper clip, and how is it that you just happen to have it? So I said in my best James Earl Jones voice, the very best officers always have a paper clip. And my God, they just bedlam broke out. That's in the book.
Yeah,
But any chance I got to shine, I took it. But I had great leadership, and that same officer gave me the worst attitude I ever had in my life. Not long after that, I took it like a man for a while, and then things devolved into a lesson in professional behavior. But I learned to take butt chewings with the best of them.
Cool. Fantastic. What's the very last question? I always ask this of everyone I have on. What's the most difficult question you've ever been asked?
The most difficult question I've ever been asked was before I filed that discrimination complaint against my CO. He called me in his office, said, "We need to put this behind us. Let's talk." I'd been ignoring him for a week, would not respond to his phone calls, his messages, etc. So I finally went over to talk to him. And I had laid out in detail all of the things that he'd been doing to discriminate against me. And I said, I want an answer. I said, this is personal. I want to know why this is happening to me. And he gave me this smirk because I had let my guard down and was showing him everything that was happening to me. So he asked me with a smirk, seeing the pain I was in, he said, "Do you feel like a second-class citizen?" And the answer internally to that question was yes. I feel like I'm being treated, like less than human, and I'm doing everything I can to make you successful. But what I said to him was, no, I don't feel like a second-class citizen. I feel like I'm being treated like one. And that was a gift because that was the cherry on top. He didn't know I'd spent a week putting together this discrimination complaint. And that was the cherry on top because never in any of our discussions had the issue of race come up. And then he lays it on the table without telling me directly, but I'm doing this to you because you're Black and I can do it. So that was the most difficult question because honestly, I wanted to say, yes, I feel like a second-class citizen, but I did not feel that way because of my internal stuff. It was because of all of the external stuff that I was having to deal with.
Yeah. Oh, wow. What a fascinating discussion. I mean, I really wish you every success with the book, with your kind of ongoing campaign to improve things. I'm sure. Hopefully, we'll get some interesting debate running just with what's on the podcast with some people when they hear it as well. Because your story is an amazing one, and I admire you enormously for sticking with it, as it were, through obviously what's been clearly a challenging career when you were in the Navy, and then a very long time since that, where, you know, as you said, you know, it's been a hard yards really in terms of working environment and losing, you know, lots of opportunities that you might have otherwise had differently. And I do wish you absolutely the very best, Keith. I think it's been great to interview you, to meet you, and I really hope that good things happen for you in the future.
Well, thank you again for your interest, and you had some really great questions. You brought some stuff out of me that other interviewers have not, and I appreciate that. And it was great being able to kind of expound on some things that you know, you'd come back and say, "Let's talk about this a little more." That was very helpful.
No, terrific. All the very best to you. Thanks ever so much, Keith. You take care.
Thank you. You as well.